Hello. In this episode of the Airs for Architecture podcast, Emirati architect and co-founder of Wholesome Studio, Azza Aboualam, discusses her curation of Pressure Cooker, the National Pavilion of the United Arab Emirates' 2025 contribution to the 19th Architecture Exhibition at the Venice Architecture Biennale. Pressure Cooker explores the UAE's evolving relationship with food production, focusing on how architectural interventions that synthesize indigenous and contemporary knowledges can address food security. Azza frames the exhibition as a response to the UAE's unique environmental, cultural and social challenges, whilst responding to the specific situated realities of everyday life in the UAE. But, might well you ask, if the spatiality of food is global, should not Pressure Cooker speak beyond borders? Well, spoiler alert, it does.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm honoured to be talking today to Azza Aboualam. Azza, you're an architect, you're a scholar, you are also the UAE's representative at this year's Architecture Biennale in Venice, which is a very short summary. Would you be so kind as to kind of open out on that for me, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Azza Aboualam. I am currently an assistant professor at Zayed University in Dubai and the co-founder of Wholesome Studio, which is an interdisciplinary design studio. I graduated from the American University of Sharjah, where I'm from, and then continued my master's at Yale, which is where I met my partners at Wholesome at the moment. And then came back to the UAE to teach and practice. And here we are today as the first female Emirati architect to represent the UAE at the Venice Biennale.
Yeah, that's quite a thing. I mean, it's a remarkable kind of trajectory. So I suppose the first question is, how did you find the Venice Biennale? Was it your first time?
It was not. So my journey started with the Venice Biennale with the National Pavilion UAE 11 years ago. I always say 10, but it's now 11 years ago, as an intern. So I was an intern at the first architecture pavilion that the Venice Biennale, where the UAE had a national participation at the architectural program or the architectural platform. And since then, I was exposed to and I was at the moment exploring a lot of the overlap of the research and design and architectural world. And that was basically my main push to pursue my master's at Yale and essentially go into the research part of architecture and design. And here we are today, 11 years later. So that was my first moment with the, being exposed to the UAE Pavilion especially, and the Venice Biennale at large.
That's great. And I suppose an interesting distinction might be between your experience of architectural studies in the Middle East and then in North America. I mean, how was that tension? Was there correspondence between the two ways of teaching? I mean, how's it done in the Middle East?
There were surprises and not so. So I studied at the American University of Sharjah. So I was exposed to the Western thinking early on in my early days. And that was all I was familiar with, essentially. And I think I started to realize the value of how much knowledge there is, or indigenous knowledge there is. When I left to study abroad and lived abroad, I noticed that I think being detached from it makes me realize the value it holds and essentially how much it's underdiscovered at the moment. And so I made it a point to actually uncover like special stories or even family backgrounds that do have overlap with the built environment or things that we are used to in the UAE, but not necessarily are explored from the built environment perspective. In addition to that, there was also the idea of what I noticed was when I went to the States was that there was a lot of focus put on being a female in the architectural world or career, which essentially, to me, coming from the UAE background, my boss was a young woman. I am a young woman, so seeing that there was a lot of emphasis on that in a surprising way, as in, oh, you're a woman coming to represent the UAE, or oh, you're a woman coming to represent the Middle East, was bizarre to the Western world, but to me, it came from a very familiar background. So there was that also an emphasis that was put on. So these two things, I think, shaped who I am today, and essentially as I move with my practice forward.
That's quite an interesting idea. And it was, as I mentioned before we started recording, my colleague here who comes from Jordan, she's found this strange as well. This
Mm-hmm.
expectation, I think, that particularly in the field of architecture, which is to all intents and purposes a fairly progressive discipline,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
at least it presents itself as that, even though it's quite conservative in many ways.
Right.
Found this kind of surprising lack of kind of representation
Mm-hmm.
actually over here, which is very fascinating. But I want to come back to this distinction between that you mentioned about recognizing the merits and values of your own cultural heritage having been in North America, like the knowledge particularly, and the
Mm-hmm.
ways of knowing. I think that's a fascinating thing. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
I think to me, it's such a shame that I had to leave and live abroad for about 4 years to actually understand how much depth there is here and value there is to be given to local knowledge. I've only come to realize how much of worth it was when people from the outside told me how fascinated they are or how interested they were when I thought it was my mundane, normal life.
Yeah.
For example, the other day I was talking, actually not the other day, but a few years ago when I was sitting at Yale, I was talking about my great grandfather's mosque, for example. And the professor that I was presenting to thought it was so fascinating that there was no documentation of that mosque. And so I started actually documenting these overlooked structures because of that under documentation. So I took it upon myself as a personal agenda to document these structures architecturally from an architectural lens, just because I thought there was value that would be lost if they were to be demolished or changed or morphed over time. Because we see it in the built environment, especially in DE, things change so rapidly
Mm.
that the idea of memory is very important.
Mhm.
And it is such a shame that I had to leave to actually understand that and then come back and pursue these. I would say personal agendas or endeavors, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. I also like this idea. I mean, the stark modernization of the Arab Peninsula over the last, what is it, 30 years? Well, certainly since the major discovery of substantial quantities of oil, I guess in the 70s, since the oil
Yeah, late
shock,
60s. Yeah.
that there's been this kind of just such a rapid urbanization and process of kind of technological modernization.
Hmm.
In a way, I think in the West, it's been a bit like boiling a frog. This thing has been going on for so long that we don't even notice when stuff is lost. And there's this kind of anxiety around when very special buildings are knocked down or burnt,
Hmm.
whatever it
Hmm.
is.
Hmm.
But in general, we're kind of just keeps happening, just keep
Yeah.
eating our countryside. And I suppose in the UAE, because it's so fast and the scale of it is so giant, these photos of these buildings that come out of that part of the world is a type of modernization that perhaps even we can't comprehend.
Hmm.
It's a really kind of intriguing moment.
Indeed. Yeah, definitely.
So, the pavilion at the UAE, what's the general concept behind this year's Venice Architecture Biennale? And maybe we can start with that before coming to your own exhibition.
So the idea of intelligence is a central theme of the Venice Biennale. So it looks at the artificial, collective, and natural, and their relationships, I would say, to architecture, and essentially how I think in this case, we could use technology to our benefit, its overlap with architecture, the built environment, how has it developed over time, etc. So these are the main themes I would say that I understood from Carlo Ratti's curation of this year's Venice Biennale.
Okay. And how did you respond? I mean, why did you respond? Maybe that's a good first question. What in that pricked your imagination?
So this year's National Pavilion UAE titled Pressure Cooker looks at the overlap of architecture and food production in the UAE. The main research question is using the UAE as a case study, how can architecture be mobilized towards greater food security? So in terms of the direct response to Carlo Arti's theme, the natural, the artificial, and the collective, we broke them down when it comes to the curatorial approach. So the natural is looked into it being the UAE's natural environment as a central theme with its restrictions and nuances. The artificial would be the use of new technology, which is the adapted digital tool created or co-curated by Wholesome Studio. that is used to analyze those greenhouses and their performance and their internal environment. So that's where the artificial or technological aspect comes in. And then the collective, it looks into how did the collective knowledge of the UAE shape the food production locally in terms of the landscape, and how can this knowledge be proliferated not just locally but internationally, especially using the arid environment as the lens. What other environments share the same climate, and can we use that same knowledge to proliferate, making that as a collective driven project, and potentially even using these bits and pieces of information to enhance ideas of the overlap of architecture and food production throughout the world globally.
I see. So there's a sort of integrated in ecological meets social agenda at play.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. So I guess, again, from an outsider's perspective, and I am to a certain extent playing devil's advocate, but one assumes the Emirates is hot and dry all the
Hmm.
time. Is that right?
Yeah. No, it's hot and, well, depends on the region. Hot and dry and hot and wet. Depends on where you are.
Okay, I mean that the wet part, where's that?
I would say along the coastlines, it would
Uh-huh.
be very humid. Yeah, but
Yeah.
in central regions, farming regions like Al Ain, which belong to the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, maybe even along the mountain range, the
Hmm.
bases of the or the foothills of Al Hajar Mountains, are relatively dry
Mm.
certain times of year. So playing with that climate and context when it comes to greenhouse design or reformulation of the greenhouse itself and its responsiveness to the context was an interesting interplay that we found in our research.
Traditionally, how has the Emirates produced its food? I mean, I assume, being coastal, it has been a trading place and it has
Mhm.
had a history of seafaring and mercantilism.
Definitely.
But what does it produce of its own that it consumes in its foodstuffs? And has the food culture of the Emirates developed sort of regionally, or does it have a very distinct kind of flavor?
I would say, in terms of its development over time, the misconception of just having dates and living on rice and fish was actually a huge finding in the archival research phase of the project. So we found that coffee grew locally, custard apples, citrus groves, a wide range of fruits and vegetables were grown locally, obviously seasonally and specific to specific contexts. But there was a wide range of crops, and those were mostly consumed locally. With the development of the country, with the oil boom, etc., and the influx of also things like fridges and refrigerators and freezers and cooking appliances, things started to come in a lot more through trade. Like rice was a huge aspect. Um, Other elements like Brazilian coffee was a huge element as well. But all of those were actually trade in transit because at the time the EU was such a small country. So docks had to be fortified because of it. And so that's how the Dubai port was developed as well in terms of elements of food trade, etc. And so with that, I would say oil boom, then also the dietary needs of people changed from I'm dependent on the fresh catch of the day to now poultry is a huge self-sufficiency story by the UAE. Eggs, dairy, these are all mega projects that started, I would say, in the 70s, and there was a lot of development and infrastructure that went into it. And so the UAE consumes regularly now mostly locally produced poultry, dairy, and also dietary needs change. So imported avocados, like I would say for the rest of the world, or fruits and vegetables are now found freshly there all year round because they are imported. However, now very recently, the National Food Security Agenda 2051 by the UAE is enhancing or pushing that. Local food production strategy in order to bump up the local food production to 50%. So that's a huge jump from about, I would say, 80 to 90% of import.
I see.
So, yeah, so that development, I would say, was also a huge factor in the research project was how will the built environment then change to adapt and accommodate these, I would say, big push to locally produce these elements because let's face it, the weather in the UAE, not all year round is conducive to growing these crops. So then we need to depend on internal cooler environments, which is what we've been seeing recently, and hence this project then developed and took that trajectory.
So there's an idea here that food production within the UAE, which you are responding to in your exhibition, is sort of in a state of crisis or is fantastic and you just need more of it. I mean, I'm kind of interested here because just talking again to one of my colleagues about this kind of notion that there is a crisis at hand. And Ratti's proposal to me seems to be situated in that field as well, that there is a crisis at play here, an environmental, ecological crisis, but also, as we saw during the COVID crisis, a sort of a problem of supply lines. Within a globalized system, supply lines are actually very tender and things can
Disrupted, yeah.
collapse very quickly. Is this what they're responding to? Is this what the Emiratis did you say 2051 plan?
Correct. Yeah.
And pressure cooker itself, your own piece of work?
I think there is an urge for action towards actually recognizing the importance of having food production being locally more of pushed towards as an agenda. I think there's value to it, definitely. I wouldn't call it a crisis, but more or less, let's recognize the importance of having self-sufficiency from the food production
Mm.
lens being more of an important element. We see it also in Sharjah, where I'm from. So wheat is now locally produced. There's huge dairy projects that are coming up, which then becomes a cyclical thing because then poultry comes out of the dairy and the wheat husks gets fed to the chickens, etc. So there is a huge emphasis on having that within the Emirati borders, right? Yes, dependency on trade, it's a huge global hub, no doubt about it. However, there is an important or emphasis placed on what happens if these are locally produced, which obviously becomes, I would say, in the long run, better for the consumer, global and climate change. As we can see, these patterns also, fields of wheat and corn are being affected elsewhere. So then, how can we respond to that using architecture, I would say, or have it help us play a role in that?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I wonder to hear a little bit more about pressure cooker as a kind of spatial intervention. But I thought perhaps we might talk about this idea because what you seem to be describing is a kind of hyper-industrialized food production system that relies upon essentially incredibly complex technologies of, greenhouses, irrigation systems, air conditioning systems, and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. Incredibly complex things to produce, cauliflowers and tomatoes and wheat, as you say, which seems to me to be perhaps actually the most significant spatial reality outside inner urbanization in the West, like the way that we produce food to facilitate that. I was talking to another colleague the other day, looking at the south of Spain, where they have all of these kind of greenhouses,
The
and I've been using
Parabha
this.
greenhouses.
Yeah, yeah. And I've been using this in teaching for about a decade, like this idea that you can address the global food crisis through urban gardens and, urban agriculture, when in fact, of course, you can't because the scale is so big. So, on the one hand, what
Hmm.
you seem to be describing in the UAE is something that's giant and hyper industrialized. And then you have pressure cooker, which is this kind of little.
Hmm.
How do you balance these two tensions? What are you trying to say through pressure cooker? And perhaps we start with what is pressure cooker? How would you describe it?
So pressure cooker, I would say, yes, it looks into the overlap of architecture and food production, but dilutes the architectural typology of the greenhouse into its basic architectural components. So it looks at the floor, the wall, the roof, tools and materials, and mixes and matches those kit of parts that we called in the project in order to create a variety of responses to what the greenhouse typology or design in its assembly could look like. What we found in the fieldwork phase for the project is that there was a lot of local indigenous knowledge when it comes to not only greenhouses, but also planting in general and agrarian practices. And so we wanted to have this project as pressure cooker be a moment in time that also gathers all of this knowledge and reformulates it in a way that looks towards the future. So essentially, what we had hoped to produce for the project is that pressure cooker produces a kit of parts that could be a modular one that looks at the domestic scale, the neighborhood scale, and essentially on the long run down the line for a farm or a city scale. And so these kit of parts, one of which actually for the domestic scale right now stands in my backyard, could potentially be adapted to the climate of Sharjah, for instance, with its use of materials and tools. We depend in the project on solely water evaporative cooling pads and fans. We don't have air conditioning as part of our kit of part or our toolkit. We noticed that it actually is very efficient within the fieldwork that we found in the UAE. Spaces were very cold. So we found that as a very positive element that we could use, and we integrated in our kit of parts. A lot of local knowledge in terms of when to plant what goes with what, in addition to the research that we found, and where to plant these elements in terms of the UAE. And the greenhouse then responds to a wetter, hotter climate versus the form of the roof could be better suited for a north-south orientation, etc. So this is essentially what the pressure cooker kit of parts is and how it corresponds to not just the UAE's environment, but also crops that could be grown and the formal architectural elements within it.
This is a kind of a deeply environmentally driven form of a neo-vernacular. Is that a fair way? Is it thinking about the vernacular as a kind of typology, as a starting off point, and then trying to scale that up?
I think so. I think we started off with the vocabulary from the vernacular, definitely, and then the neo comes in by its reformulation or reconfiguration. That would be, I think, a better word to use here. And scaling it up, scaling it down, altering it based on the user's needs versus location, time of year. And again, all of these kits that you would essentially see when you walk into the exhibition, they might look like familiar greenhouses that you've seen in the UAE. Some other people, for example, from Oman were visiting, and they mentioned how familiar the form looked like. And I told them, actually, there are some modifications to the form that make it not entirely familiar. So that's what I think, pride ourselves in the project, is that the vocabulary is from the region, but then reformulated for the region and beyond, hopefully.
Obviously, in vernacular studies, there's this idea that, perhaps a more sensitive idea, that vernacular forms are derivative not just of ecological or environmental imperatives, but also of foundationally from the kind of cultic practices or the behavioral practices of the community. How does pressure cooker engage with the way people do farming, the way people do growing, and particularly food growing within the UAE and as you say, regionally?
It's fascinating, actually, because most of the models that we see in terms of greenhouses right now are imported, whether it be from the Netherlands or China, which we've seen more often than not. And so there's a fascinating story that was written in the publication, actually, about a greenhouse model that was adapted to be built for tomatoes and cucumbers, etc., but was reformulated on site for papayas. It wasn't tall enough. So on site, the steel, the fans were reconfigured in order to usher that growth. And so I think that idea stuck with me. And so I would say the kit of parts or the modularity of the project then allows for the user, him or herself, to, whether be it make the wall taller because next year they decided to grow cucumbers instead of potatoes, for instance, or the roof has operable panels that could usher in cooler air only in the fall and the spring, where it's the cusp of the seasons. So these changes or slight modifications are not just by the kit built in, but they are also by the user. So you have that sense of ownership to grow your own specific crops, but also alter the greenhouse assembly based on that need. I'm sure every year you won't be growing cucumbers. Obviously, by all means, go for it if that's what your intention is. But what if one year your kids wanted to grow, let's say, more, for example, oranges, and the year after you wanted zucchinis? So all of these things and plants and crops have different needs, different humidity levels, different irrigation cycles. And so I would say the modularity of the kit of parts allows for that multitude of responses, not just by the structure itself, but by the user as well.
And this idea, this modularity is, I think, probably a clear response to Colorati's idea of a sort of collective notion. I mean, is that at the heart of it as well, that you're trying to design something that facilitates as you say, a sort of ongoing constructive process, which is, I guess, in a way about the reconstruction of cultures.
Definitely.
Is that because
Yeah.
under current kind of regimes of agricultural and particularly food growing production, you feel that there is a kind of an erasure occurring?
Honestly, I would say the idea of collective came in on different levels. Erasure is an issue because we found, for example, a lot of the greenhouses that we've seen um, were either deteriorating because people gave up on them in the field because A, they were too expensive, or people didn't have enough knowledge to keep them going, or they thought to themselves might as well invest that money into natural air, or I would say traditional irrigation systems. However, I think the idea of collective mainly in the project is looking at how can food production and crops growing and the human aspect can exist in a new form of a third space. So essentially, if it were to be a greenhouse assembly in a domestic space, that would be a majlis or a gathering space for the family. That doesn't necessarily rely on air conditioning, right? But also allows your kids to learn where tomatoes grow or how zucchini vines are tall this year. Versus when it becomes a neighborhood, it would be, or on a neighborhood scale, it would be a larger intervention that perhaps could tap into parks or public irrigation systems and electrical systems that could, again, usher in a new type of gathering space, essentially, or a new way where people can come together in the heat, but in a much sheltered, cooler environment. And potentially down the road, if it were to be a farm or a city scale, then it would be a larger gathering space, having maybe potentially even workspaces, or I I might be shooting for the stars, but could be like a library, or people can grow their own food and learn from this journey from food to table, right? Or growing your farm, essentially your crops, and bringing that to the table that you would consume in. So essentially, that was the main idea of collective. And then obviously other things came into collective knowledge and documenting it and making sure that we have record of it, and seeing all these greenhouses and farms being deteriorating, for example, in thriving areas that my mother used to tell me Ras Al Khaimah was this huge farming location in the UAE. When I went, I was shocked as to see those farms not as thriving as they used to be when she used to forage as a young girl. So all these elements play into the idea of collective in the project.
It's an interesting idea, this idea of memory being sort of hard written into the project, this kind of loss of, as you say, a collective identity, but on a sort of personal level, which is funny
Hmm.
because I feel that myself. I think everybody feels that all the time, this collapsing sense of cultural heritage, just of the ordinary kind. But it brings me
Yeah.
to a point that I'm always interested in, which is when architecture engages with indigenous culture. We have a very romantic idea of it. Architecture walks backwards, we to some degree fetishize, romanticize indigenous culture. And that sort of,
Mm.
on one level, is kind of interesting. But on the other level, there is an argument to say that perhaps there is a slight quality of appropriation. That as architects, we come from this background of professional knowledge. We live with very high social capital, often enough economic capital, cultural capital. How does pressure cooker negotiate or engage with this possibility that what you're proposing is possibly what's the right word? I suppose the occupation of a space which isn't appropriately ours. That is to say, it is indigenous space, it is non-professional space, it is folklore culture. That
Hmm.
farming isn't done by people like us. Or,
Hmm.
or are you arguing that the crisis of cultural attrition, but also food instability, is so far advanced that we need to sort of set aside concerns over those kinds of sensitivities in favor of
Hmm.
a new collective approach?
I think the latter, definitely. I believe in, I think that, well, it's funny because the story actually started by a question by my mother, that when she asked me where are the local blueberries coming from today, because she asks me every time I go to the grocery store as to where the apples are from today, or where did the tomatoes, are they flown in? And I used to get so frustrated about how much I had to keep track of everything that was flown in that day. And I think no. recently I've noticed that a lot of the labels have changed to locally grown or made in the UAE, and I actually told her that they are locally grown, and she was so surprised, and she said, "Oh, there must be greenhouses involved," and that's how the project started. But I think there was that moment of realization of I don't even know where the blueberries come from. I'm proud that they are locally grown, but I consume them regularly. I know my friends have them in their fridges all the time, but do we actually know where they come from? And I think there was a lot of that moment gave me a lot of push into realizing actually there are local strides in food production. Yes, blueberries is a small fraction of it, but can we become as a collective more aware of these strides, more aware of the effort that goes into these things, more aware of the funding, the technicalities, and I think that also enhances the amount of attachment that one has, not just into what their food comes from, looks like, or where it comes from, or how it's grown, but also how it is grown and how much, I would say, adversity was overcome just to grow that local blueberry, right? I'm pretty sure there is much more that comes into it. And that collective awareness, I think, was an important aspect that I would hope for the kit of parts that we have in the pressure cooker project to, if it were to do something just to raise that awareness of that collective knowledge.
Rati's theme also implied a sort of use of these emergent technologies, very rapidly emergent technologies like artificial intelligence. How does your exhibition, Pressure Cooker, engage with these kinds of things? Because I think you've articulated very clearly this idea of this desire to get people to get their hands in the soil if they need them
Hmm.
to,
Hmm.
to get that kind of situated Heideggerian idea of, craft and making and growing, and
Yeah,
which I think is very beautiful, and I sort of fundamentally agree with. But we've then got this other side of things, which is
yeah.
these technologies. How do you deal with that? How does this inevitability get assimilated
Hmm.
into your proposal?
I think just going back to your backyard, I think there's a lot of things to learn from failure also, as in terms of, because I know that's what happened in the field where we've seen a lot of people fail and use the greenhouses again the year after and after, and until they find a way. Like someone was planting wheat for 60 years until he actually got it right and then learned from these techniques, right? So I think it is embedded within the project, no doubt about it. It is, I would say, it does have a romantic undertone, I'm not going to lie, or an idealistic undertone in terms of the kit of parts that everyone or anyone could use it. Yes, there are elements to it as well that people need to be aware of. However, I think the technological, and going back to your question, technological aspect, I would say comes in from the adaptive tool, the digital tool that we've created with Wholesome Studio for this project that essentially takes the kit of parts and its agglomeration of pieces and its assembly and analyzes that assembly based on the context and its performance. So how many days out of the year is it above 30 degrees, which is the cutoff point for us to grow specific types of crops, for instance. And so this tool, or I would say artificial intelligence, right, or essentially the digital aspect of the project, then comes into play, analyzing the performance of the greenhouse assembly, looking into where it's located in the world. And if the user then chooses to build their own kit of parts, then they could redesign it in the tool and study their performance based on that location. Like, for example, this uh, I would want to grow this type of crop, then probably I'll have this assembly go with it in that region if I'm growing in Sharjah, for instance. What if I raise the roof higher? Then that means I can't grow tomatoes, I can grow cucumbers. And so it analyzes the performance, and essentially down the line, if the person doesn't want to grow, they just want to build the greenhouse and have maybe their brother or someone they're related to or a friend grow things, and they could divide, right? They could divide and share the tasks. Someone could build and analyze using the digital tool and the open source versus someone who actually has a green thumb and would grow these elements. And so now that becomes also another communal aspect to the project, right? It becomes more of a shared archive, a shared knowledge base that could then bring people together in different ways.
So through this, you kind of can envisage a kind of global network, that this project has flexibility, if not scalability, certainly flexibility to be applied in contexts that are not just hot and arid. with
exactly.
coastal moisture, but could be applied in a soggy place like Britain, for example.
For example, yeah, yeah. I mean, the we've noticed in the research that heating the space for a greenhouse is actually a much easier problem to have than cooling it down. So maybe then the kit of parts could be much more accommodating in the west or northwest than
Yeah.
here.
I think this is a really fascinating idea, and I think it's a very elegant idea as well. But what has been the response to the exhibition, to Pressure Cooker? How have you found the response of the, I guess, the critics, of the public, and back home in
Mhm.
UAE?
I think the some of the ideas or notions that came up, responses, reactions were those that struck me were those that said, "Oh, actually, we could do that essentially next week," right? It's that approachability of, yes, let's build it in this project or integrate it there. I've had a couple of conversations that mentioned how I think the feasibility of it was huge, striking aspect, and it was a message that I essentially was very adamant for it to go across, and thankfully it did. So that was one, I would say, positive response we received. Other responses and other interesting conversation we've had on in the pavilion on site was how could these be modular for the city scale, which is something as a team we were looking into down the line as to how these structures are now mainly for a neighborhood or a domestic scale, but how could they be modified architecturally to accommodate for expansions on a city scale. So that was a great conversation that we've had. Others were obviously, yes, not having a green thumb or the concerns of, no, I can't grow anything my entire life. How can this help me? And I think through conversations, we realized, yes, it is definitely, it does have an idealistic undertone, but hopefully down the line, I would say people can come together to, I would say, pool their knowledge and have that pressure cooker as a shell to usher that food production techniques and being it locally emphasized through these modular kind of parts, right? They don't necessarily have to just be a shell that just stands there and grows tomatoes, but how can people interact with them? And I think observing people in the space also interacting with these elements was also interesting, seeing how people would look up to the green shade net or the green fiberglass and noticing, for example, there's cucumbers hanging on the side or the tomatoes suspended above them, and asking these questions and answering them was, I think, part of realizing how much, I think, more work we have to do actually now that the exhibition is up.
I just want to finish on one last question, which is the even broader applicability of this kind of idea. I kind of love this tripartite concept of cultivate culture, which is an idea derived from a social activist that I'm particularly fond of. But this idea of cultivation leading to broader culture, or at the heart of broader culture, the word in the English language derived from the Latin to cultivate. So there's this idea at the heart of it, which is how we grow things. I mean, if you go back to the beginning, how we worship things is how we grow things, is how we produce culture. It's tripartite opening out of culture. But I start with cultivation. How do you see this kind of model that you're proposing, which is a sort of technical innovation or perhaps interpretation or translation of indigenous culture or indigenous practices, perhaps, into a kind of technological, potentially scalable global model? How do you see this
Mhm.
working more broadly in architecture as a whole? So moving beyond the greenhouse, does
Mhm.
this have the potential to translate?
Oh, absolutely. I think seeing that it started from, I would say, a personal question to just noticing patterns from how, for example, our neighbors share tomatoes every November or aubergines and eggplants specific times of the year. Just observing that, I think observing natural patterns, cultural patterns, and feeding that into a research project, feeding that into an exploration of how the built environment responds to those social cues, then that could be applicable, I would say, to any architectural research agenda or endeavor. Essentially, just looking, I would say, just looking and observing your surroundings, taking note of these patterns that you take for granted, I took for granted all my life, and finding the value in it and having the architectural aspect or the built environment as in your background or in the back of your mind, then it comes in naturally. You start to see these patterns, start to see these stories develop into, oh, that's why that building looks like that because there's a story behind, I don't know who built it or how they live their lives or how their house is structured. We found a lot of misfit greenhouses, right, within these backyards. But why are they like that? Because someone decided last minute to build it because the X, Y, and Z, right? So essentially just tracing these patterns could be applicable to any cultural norm / architectural built environment intervention.
That's very interesting. That wasn't the question I was asking at all, but it's fascinating that you come to the method of the
Yeah.
design method. I think that's a really brilliant way of finishing this podcast. Thank you so very much, Azza. That's wonderful to hear you talk about the project.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate having me.
I'm eating souffle, but I've never been to France. Tyler, the creator, that isn't good enough. Get local and grow your own souffle. Thank you to Azza for the conversation, and to Florian and Jan of Send Receive for enabling it. Please see the podcast description for links to Azza and to Pressure Cooker. And thanks for listening.